On this Friday night, Fiona comes crashing into Canada. Anxiety in the Atlantic as people stock up on supplies and brace for impact.
My main concern is how long it's going to last for.
The historic post-tropical storm set to roar ashore in just hours. A gruesome report on Russian war crimes in Ukraine.
Relatives were forced to witness the crimes.
The findings from UN investigators as the Kremlin holds sham referendums in Russian-occupied areas. Cracking down on dissent and cutting off the internet.
All of us are very concerned.
Fears over what Iran will do next to silence feminists. Plus, serving up one last match. Tennis great Roger Federer retires his racket tonight.
Global National with Farah Nasser. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. People in Atlantic Canada are bracing for one of the worst storms this country has ever seen. Here's a snapshot of what's coming. This dramatic drone video shows wild waves in the Atlantic Ocean as Hurricane Fiona slammed into Bermuda. Now that hurricane is poised to become a powerful post-tropical storm by the time it crashes into Canada's coast overnight. Let's go straight to our Ross Lord now, who is in Port Hastings for us in Nova Scotia tonight. So Ross, how are things looking there now?
Well, Jeff, the rain is well underway. The wind only now beginning to pick up. Some of the waves kicking up on the rocks here at the Canso Causeway, at or near where forecasters say Fiona will make landfall in just a few hours. The causeway is the connection between Cape Breton and the mainland, and it's a key indicator because how well it endures Fiona will be a good indication of the storm's impact.
That this could potentially be one of the worst storms that Canada's coast has ever seen.
When it comes to bad weather, Cape Bretoners don't scare easily. They'd rather joke about loading up on snack food.
Well, I use this one as an excuse to get storm chips.
A little anxious, I guess.
But she admits in the hours before Fiona's arrival, it's hard to keep fear at bay. Store shelves are running low on essential supplies like canned goods, camp stoves, and lanterns. People loading up for a struggle, with warnings Fiona's extreme wind and torrential rain could cause widespread damage and power outages throughout Atlantic Canada for days or even weeks.
My main concern is how long it's going to last for. That's the biggest thing. So I have a tendency to go with my priorities, of course, with there's water and so on, and things that I can actually cook, and because I'm going to have limited electricity, of course.
Some meteorologists foresee Fiona making landfall as a post-tropical storm, but with the impact of a Category 2 hurricane, like the devastating Hurricane Juan did 19 years ago.
In terms of the storm size, it's certainly bigger than Juan was when Juan made landfall in 2003. In terms of Dorian, it's comparable in terms of its size, but it's stronger than Dorian was back in 2019.
In Nova Scotia, a province-wide emergency alert told people to avoid the coastline and rivers, a message many seem to be heeding.
We're really hunkered down. Anything that was outside that could possibly be moved is packed away in the garage. We got some food cooked ahead of time, so we won't be hungry for the next 72 hours.
It's what Michelle McDonald can't control that bothers her, like what will happen to these trees.
And the trees make me nervous because they're hanging over the power lines, and they're older trees. And we lost quite a few during Dorian, and some of the houses here lost power for 5 days because of it.
Emergency planners, including power utilities, have been preparing all week for Fiona's arrival.
Doing tabletop exercises, making sure we're ready for a command center if need be, making sure we're ready for comfort centers if need be.
We saw a stream of trucks holding power line repair crews coming into Port Hawkesbury area this evening. Some of the hundreds of crews that have been put on standby for what forecasters expect to be a grueling weekend in Atlantic Canada and in eastern Quebec. Jeff?
All right, Ross Lord in Port Hastings, Nova Scotia. Take care. Thanks, Ross. And for more on what to expect from this storm, let's bring in Global's chief meteorologist, Anthony Farnell. He joins us now from Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, essentially the edge of the Atlantic. So, Anthony, what's it like where you are right now?
Well, we may not get the center of the storm passing directly overhead, but what's going to happen tonight are likely some of the worst winds, waves, and surge that Fiona has to offer, and that really has residents around here in Cape Breton quite concerned this time around versus some of the prior hurricanes like Dorian, like Juan, that maybe spared this region a little bit more than others. So the winds have been picking up. We're getting these outer bands that are now moving in. Each time it rains again, the winds are a little bit stronger, and really the worst of it's going to be after midnight tonight through the morning hours tomorrow. That surge coinciding with high tide in the morning, that's a big concern, 1 to maybe 2 meters. And then the waves, incredible waves of 10 to as much as 15 meters just off the coast, causing erosion and possibly some damage and washed out roads as well. The wind, 150, 160 kilometers per hour in gusts. And this is going to extend, maybe not to that level, but 100 plus kilometer per hour winds for much of the province, including Halifax, into New Brunswick as well. So it's a massive, massive storm and a record breaker as far as intensity goes. Jeff?
Wow, some tense hours ahead. And what can you tell us, Anthony, about exactly where Fiona is headed and the punch that she's expected to pack?
Well, it's hard to believe that just last night, that's when the hurricane was making its closest approach to Bermuda, and now later tonight, it'll be directly overhead here. So once it arrives, it's slowing down. So those hurricane force gusts are going to be around for 6 to 12 hours for Cape Breton and for parts of the mainland. Same thing with PEI, which is going to feel it, especially those North Shore beaches are going to just take a beating. And then it moves into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Ile de Madeleine, the western part of Newfoundland feeling the hurricane as well. Weakening as it does so, it gets away from the warm waters, it loses that energy source, but this is going to be a long weekend for residents around here. Jeff?
All right, Global News meteorologist Anthony Farnell in Louisbourg, Nova Scotia. Stay safe. Thanks, Anthony. And that extreme weather on the East Coast comes just as young people took to the streets across Canada today, part of an international day of climate action to highlight the devastating impacts of global warming, while also demanding more aid for poorer countries that are struggling to cope. Climate protests were held in Vancouver, Kingston, Ontario, and in Quebec. And thousands of young people also rallied at New Zealand's parliament today as part of that global day of climate action. While in South Korea's capital, students skipped school for their Fridays for Future rally. 11 people there were killed just last month after a devastating rainstorm. And 22,000 people rallied in Berlin today, one of 250 German cities organizing events. Activists there calling for an end to fossil fuels and expansion of renewable energy. And another story we're tracking in Atlantic Canada tonight. The public portion of the inquiry into the worst mass shooting in modern Canadian history has finally drawn to a close. The hearings of the 2020 Nova Scotia massacre spanned 7 months and included more than 200 witnesses and thousands of documents. Well, on this final day, the 3 commissioners leading the investigation shared their thoughts ahead of their final report that's expected early next year. As Graeme Benjamin explains, the victims' families hope it will lead to long-lasting change.
We must together take action to build safer communities.
Commissioner Michael MacDonald offering his final thoughts as the inquiry into the April 2020 Nova Scotia mass shooting finally comes to an end.
We took on this responsibility to ensure that all those whose lives have been taken will not have been in vain.
The Mass Casualty Commission has been trying to discover exactly what happened during a 13-hour period on April 18th and 19th, 2020, when a denturist disguised as a police officer killed 22 people in several rural Nova Scotia communities. Since February 22nd, witness after witness has taken the stand. Now, the commissioners must create a final report, one that potentially includes recommendations to ensure a tragedy of this magnitude never happens again.
The final report will be comprehensive. It needs to be both broad and deep, in order to fulfill our mandate.
But getting to this point has been difficult. Faith in the process has dwindled day by day, with special accommodations being given to key RCMP decision makers. For its part, the Department of Justice asserting that the accommodations followed the Commission's trauma-informed mandate, and that officers responded to the shooting the best they could with the resources available.
No response to a critical incident of this magnitude could be perfect. But when this crisis hit, the RCMP showed up.
Lawyers representing families of the victims say recommendations are not enough if they don't lead to real action.
We're going to see recommendations that are not just good on paper, but that will, meaningfully change the public safety for a positive way.
The final report is scheduled to be released to the public by March 31st, 2023 at the latest. Graeme Benjamin, Global News, Halifax.
After a nearly year-long vacancy, Canada has finally appointed its new ambassador to China. Jennifer May is a 30-year veteran diplomat whose work has spanned 3 continents. Most recently, May served as Canadian ambassador to Brazil. She's also the first woman named to the post in Beijing. The Canadian Prime Minister tweeted about May's appointment. As Canada's ambassador to China, she'll manage this important bilateral relationship and advance Canadian interests. The Kremlin's so-called referendums are now underway in 4 Russian-occupied regions of Ukraine. Voters there are being asked if they want to leave Ukraine and join the Russian Federation. Thousands of Russians took to the streets to show their support, but in Kyiv and across the West, that vote is being widely condemned as a sham. There are fears the results will be used as a pretext for President Putin to escalate his aggression. Meanwhile, we're also learning more disturbing details about a United Nations inquiry that found Russia carried out a, quote, large number of war crimes in those voting regions. Jackson Prosco has the details.
In 4 occupied regions of Ukraine, there's only one question on the ballot. Yes or no to joining Russia? I am ready to vote, says this woman. I wish we had support from Russia much earlier. The so-called referendum is happening under the long shadow of Russian violence and oppression in a region where at least half the population has fled. I am against the referendum, she says. I think that my town and my region fully belong to Ukraine. Ukraine and the West have decried the vote as a sham, warning the predetermined result will be a pretext for Russia to take more drastic military measures.
When that's complete, we can expect President Putin will claim any Ukrainian effort to liberate this land as an attack on so-called Russian territory.
An independent UN commission concludes Russia has already committed extensive war crimes in the regions, including the rape and torture of children.
We were struck by the large number of executions in the areas that we visited.
Vladimir Putin has also threatened the use of nuclear weapons. His decision to call up 300,000 reservists has rattled Russia. Buses were seen taking men away to fight after tearful goodbyes to their families. At the border with neighboring Finland, young Russian men rushed to flee.
When Putin has his speech, I just pack my bag and directly go to Finland.
I definitely don't want to be drafted or this kind of thing, that's for sure.
Back in the occupied regions, voting will run until Tuesday, a simple formality before Russia makes the inevitable move to annex more of Ukraine's territory. Jackson Prosco, Global News.
Iran deals with dissent. Coming up, the regime grapples with its most serious challenge in years. Plus, flood-ravaged Pakistan scrambles to stop the spread of disease. Welcome back. Tensions are escalating in Iran between protesters and the government. It's been 1 week since 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died after being detained by the country's so-called morality police. Well, today, the U.S. gave the green light to expand internet services to Iranians cut off by the state. And as Heather Yourex-West explains, with growing protests, there's also mounting concern over how Iran's regime will respond.
In this video shot by the Iraqi news agency Referendum, shots can be heard over protests in the city of Sardasht. A similar scene in the western city of Urmia. though it's been a week since the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini sparked outrage across the country. Video of the protests have become harder for the world to see.
Internet is super slowed down. Two major applications, WhatsApp and Instagram, are shut down.
It's something Iranians have witnessed their government do before, and what it signals is chilling.
All of us are very concerned about what's going on in Iran because we had a very bad experience with internet shutdown. And when the internet is cut, it means that they're gonna start a mass murder.
In 2019, amidst widespread protests over fuel prices, the government shut down internet access for 4 days while implementing a brutal crackdown on the streets. Amnesty International estimates more than 300 people were killed. The U.S. Secretary of State wrote Friday, "We took action today to advance internet freedom for the Iranian people, issuing a general license to provide them greater access to digital communications." A spokesperson for the UN Secretary General also appealed for calm.
We call on security forces to refrain from using unnecessary and disproportionate force and appeal to all to exercise restraint to avoid further escalation.
According to Iranian state television, more than 24 protesters and police have been killed in the last week. In Tehran Friday, a state-organized counter-demonstration was held, with marchers calling for the execution of protesters. After years of growing unrest, this may become Iran's moment of reckoning. Heather, Yourex-West, Global News.
In flood-ravaged Pakistan, thousands of additional doctors are being deployed to the country's hardest-hit province in an effort to slow the rapid spread of diseases, tearing through shelters and makeshift camps. 18,000 doctors and nearly 38,000 paramedics are already treating survivors in Sindh province, where hundreds of thousands of people displaced by the devastating floods are now living in the open, washing, drinking, and living around stagnant water, which is leading to widespread cases of malaria, typhoid, and dengue fever. Health authorities say malaria has already killed more than 300 people there, and in the past week has infected some 44,000. Next, Global News drills down on Canada's energy dilemma. Unlocking Canada's energy wealth, helping European allies starved of oil and gas, while also cutting greenhouse gas emissions is a tall order, but it may not be impossible. In a one-hour special tonight, Global News drills down on the role Indigenous communities might play and how energy entrepreneurs are finding new opportunities. David Aiken looks at the political will and emissions targets that may be needed to get Canadian natural gas to Europe. David.
Well, Jeff, let's look at two angles on this issue of getting natural gas to Europe. First, to Brad Wall, who, of course, spent a decade as Saskatchewan's premier. He's a veteran of FedProv meetings, and since he's out of politics these days, he can speak a little more freely.
So I visited Wall earlier this summer near his home in southwest Saskatchewan, where he spends a lot of time on his horse these days, learning to be a cowboy. And so after a session of roping and branding calves, we talked about how the energy and climate discussion in Canada changed with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Canada can perhaps help on the LNG front in Europe if they want to get off of Russian supply, but in order for us to do that, we got to be able to get it to port.
But Quebec has long opposed any new pipeline that would take Western gas to an Atlantic port. Wall believes it is the premiers themselves who should lead the discussion on that issue.
I think Quebec would bristle, and most provinces would, at the notion of a federal government saying, all right, this pipeline is happening, and we're going to put the full weight of the federal government behind it. I think the answer has got to be the premiers.
Now, what to do about greenhouse gas emissions? Polls have consistently shown that Canadians want their country to be a green good guy, if you will. So for this question, I went to Montreal to talk to Chris Reagan, an economist at McGill University, who is an advocate of much more aggressive climate policy. But he says if Canadian natural gas could get to Europe, it could displace dirty coal and oil there.
So in a global sense, this will reduce emissions. This is a good idea. But in Canada, it will increase emissions because we will burn a pile of natural gas to run the compressors to liquefy that LNG, and so we may blow past our targets. And then you say, maybe we don't have the right domestic target for a world that has these ambitions and has these energy security issues.
So these are just a couple of the ideas, Jeff, that we will explore in our special tonight as we try to figure out if Canada can indeed be an energy superpower while still meeting its climate change commitments.
David Aiken in Ottawa. Thanks, David. And you can watch Landlocked, Canada's Energy Dilemma at 9 Eastern and Pacific, 10 Mountain, right here on Global. And that is Global National for this Friday night. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada is this pronghorn antelope near Lancer, Saskatchewan. Thanks for watching. Farah Nasser will be at the anchor desk with you tomorrow. Have a great night.